This 4x4 Chevy Trailblazer needs front brakes, so I've put it up on jack stands. Now I'm taking off the front wheel, exposing the brakes. The first thing I will do is take off the caliper. There's two bolts to hold the caliper on from the back. Use a 17mm socket. Then I'm going to hang the caliper from a bungee wrapped around the coil. That just keeps it from damaging the brake line, putting a lot of stress on the brake line. Keeps it out of the way. And then I will remove the hanger. It's two more bolts from the back side, 18mm socket. You probably need a breaker bar to bust these loose. They're torqued quite a bit heavier. Then zip the bolts the rest of the way back out. I'm just using an air ratchet here. This hanger holds the caliper and the brake pads. Should be able to remove the whole thing then. Just those two bolts. Then the brake rotor should just pull off. If not, you might have to jack it away from the hub. Here I'm showing the hanger in a vise, and I'm just taking the old hardware out. There's the two pads. These are the slider pins. They just pull out. And then there are boots that we're going to replace. Hold the grease in and keep the dirt out of the sliders. There's the boot. They're kind of pressed in. Then there's shims as well. So two boots, two shims. I'm going to clean up the area that the shims ride on, because as this hanger rusts, that rust will push the shims into the pads, and the pads won't slide back and forth well. So give them a good scrubbing with a steel brush. And I've taken that whole hanger over to the parts washer, and I'm cleaning out the old brake lube inside the sliders and cleaning the whole thing up, cleaning all the dust away from when I was working on it with the wire brush. And I'll spray that clear of all the solvent, get it dry. I'm doing the same cleanup process to the slide pins, cleaning them up, drying them out, make sure I get all the old lube off them. And then I've bought the hardware pack. Always buy the hardware pack when you're doing a brake job. You get all new hardware, all the new shims, squealers, boots if they have it. In this case there's boots. I squeezed a little brake lube into the slider housing, and now I'm putting the new boots in using a socket. I think this was a 19mm or 18mm socket that fit over the boot real well, and it allows me to tap that metal part of the boot into the hanger. And I'll lube up the pins too, and then they just push in. So two of those boots, and putting the slider pins back in. There's the shim, the new shim, all shiny and nice. It's nice buying the hardware pack because you get new shims. The old shims are corroded and dirty, and anything that'll hold those pads up, they'll hang up and then they'll wear uneven. So new shims. There is a front and a back, so just kind of make sure you got them right. And then in the hardware pack comes these new squealers, and they clip onto the ends, both ends of all the pads. And then the end of that squealer will stick out, and as the pads wear down, they'll start to drag on the rotor and make a little squealing noise, letting you know that it's running low on brake pad. I'm going to lube up the back of the pads with some brake lube. If you don't have a tube of brake lube, they do sell little tiny packets when you're buying the brake shoes. And they just slide in the new shims. And I've prepared the other pad the same way. Squealers on both ends, lube on the back, and that hanger's ready to go back on. Before we do that, we're going to put a brand new rotor on. Buy new rotors. They're like 28 bucks. Just get the new rotor and hold that on with a lug nut so it's not wobbling around trying to fall off. And you got to clean up the new rotors because a lot of times they'll be covered in a grease or something that when they're new to keep them from rusting in the box. So get those good and clean. And then you can put your whole new hanger or rebuilt hanger back on with its new brake pads. Put the two bolts in the back. We're going to torque those good and tight, 95 foot-pounds. And before we can install the caliper, we've got to press the pistons back into the caliper. And I'm using an old brake pad and a big C-clamp. You have to use the old brake pad so you can push on both pistons at once. And just tighten that down until they're pushed all the way back in. And then there's a anti-rattle clip that needs to be replaced. It comes in your hardware pack. Pull that out. All rusty and crappy. There's your new shiny one. Push it back in. Then we can reinstall the caliper. You might have to push the slide pins in to be able to get the caliper on the outside of them. And put those two bolts back in. We'll torque those just to 25 foot-pounds. This is clamping aluminum, doesn't need the torque of the two cast pieces like the hanger. Take that lug nut off. Put the tire back on. The four-wheel drive Chevy Trailblazer has 6 lugs, and a lot of people tell you to use a star pattern. Well, with 6, you got to do the noon, 6, 2, 4. No, I'm sorry, 2, 8, 4, 10 pattern. Then back on the ground, off the jack stands, I'll torque them down to 95 foot-pounds. Slap the cover over the lugs, and then you've got to pump the brakes before you go down the road. This will move the pistons back out of the caliper and push the pads up against the rotor so they're ready for use. Do that and test it at low speed. Test the brakes at low speed before you get ripping down the road. Be sure to subscribe and click on the gear button to get yourself a hat or a t-shirt.